Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute. His Substack is tritaparsi.substack.com. Thank you so much for coming on. We got a lot to talk about. I'm going to fix the live production real quick because it still says Rokana here because that's the last person I interviewed.
So you put your tie on for him or for me?
No, I wear the tie all the time now. It's just it's a common fixture. The more the Republicans attack me, and they're attacking me. Fox News is attacking me right now because of things I said about Lindsey Graham. Instead of eulogizing him in the way that many others have, I called him an odious warmonger of the highest order. And Fox News was so frustrated by that they chose to write a whole article on it saying, controversial radical streamer Hasan Piker. But it's funny because I think it's backfired on them. Because as far as I understand, even on Facebook, people are actually saying he's right. They're agreeing with me. How do you feel about the legacy of Lindsey Graham? Let's start there before we get into obviously the next steps and what's going on with this memorandum of understanding turning into a memorandum of misunderstanding.
Look, to me, Graham was essentially a dying breed of hawkish Republicans who thought that there always was a military solution to whatever problem or non-problem that existed in the world, and drove the United States in an absolutely terrible direction. And at every moment, there was this effort to sabotage diplomacy from his end, belittle it, and shift things back towards some sort of a muscular, military-centric approach, which I think is ultimately has been disastrous for the world, but also very, very disastrous for the United States itself. And I do think it's fair to scrutinize his track record in the Middle East in particular, because his proximity to Israel and to the UAE, I think deserves scrutiny. Even after everyone had essentially given up, realizing it is an idiotic idea, he was still pushing to expand the Abraham Accords and make Israel the center of the region, having the Saudis normalize relations with them, throw the Palestinians even further under the bus. Remember, this is the guy who said that we should just flatten Gaza, to do to Gaza what was done by the U.S. against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I think that speaks for itself.
Yeah, absolutely. This was, he was one of Israel's most loyal soldiers. One of the aspects of his legacy, I think, that was ironically reported on extensively in the aftermath of his untimely demise is the fact that he was a champion of this latest war, this latest military quagmire that the United States found itself in. He was the middleman between Israel and Donald Trump, something that has been reported on and openly admitted by Benjamin Netanyahu as well. And now we're seemingly going back to war. You were a little bit more positive about the memorandum of understanding than I was. I was a little bit more skeptical about whether or not this would be implemented. How do you feel right now?
I think it's a devastating situation. I don't think it was inevitable. I think there were a lot of ambiguities in the memorandum at some point needed to be clarified. They failed to do so in the manner that they should have. I know based on conversations I had that there was a different position earlier on some of these issues, and it frankly, on the American side, and it frankly hardened. I think it's partly because there are different elements inside of this administration, some of them whose perspective is much, much closer to that of Lindsey Graham, who were against this memorandum. I personally think that as soon as the MOU was signed, Marco Rubio, that by and large has stayed out of this issue, kept his arms distance from this war, from the diplomacy, suddenly shows up, meets with the GCC countries, pushes for a very harsh position, a joint statement, and then he afterwards says, tolls, fees, all of them are completely unacceptable. And by taking that position, he really narrowed the pathway to an agreement. Remember, the idea of fees, that instead of a toll, there would be some sort of environmental management fee of the strait that would be collected either by Iran and Oman. It was actually an Omani idea, collected by Iran and Oman, or collected by several of the states in the region, not just the Iranians. Actually had some support inside of the administration earlier on, but that apparently changed. And Rubio pushed for this line that narrowed the pathway. Then he flew to Lebanon, and there he negotiated or mediated this complete Lebanese surrender to the Israelis with this agreement between the two countries that has even been harshly criticized by the most ferocious Hezbollah haters inside of Lebanon as a complete sellout of the country. But perhaps from the standpoint of this conversation, most importantly, that agreement contradicted the MOU. And to me, it did appear very difficult to interpret that as something else than an effort to sabotage the MOU. So I think some of these things that have happened were not inevitable. I think there were efforts from many different sides to make it more difficult. And I think also the Iranians overreacted to a couple of these things. And then over the course of the last 3 or so weeks, I've detected that the Iranians have increasingly had become convinced that Trump was going to go to war with Iran again. And I think that also colored their decisions and the manner in which they perceived everything else that was happening. It was perceived as if it were to validate their suspicion that Trump was gearing up for another war. And I think then they made decisions based on that that frankly potentially helped make that a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It turns out they were correct, though, right? I mean, there is some evidence, at least now, also the very fact that the MOU is done. Trump is saying that the war is back on. But the conversation that took place with J.D. Vance going on Michael Knowles' broadcast to openly admit that the memorandum of understanding was simply just to offer a moment of respite to the strategic oil reserves that were nearing crisis levels. Obviously, if it goes below 300 million barrels, you're reaching a red line. When there's a hard limit beneath 150 million, where the salt caverns that a lot of our strategic oil reserves are stored in could possibly collapse due to a lack of pressure. This hard limit is obviously something that the American side is paying close attention to, and we have a higher priority beyond simply managing oil and gas prices in the United States of America to ensure that the European markets do not collapse, right? So we're constantly exporting oil elsewhere. That limit has now, I guess, that crisis point has now been pushed back maybe 20 days. Is there anything different on the American side, on the American calculation this time around? Because every military analyst that I'm listening to that goes on, CBS and whatnot, keeps repeatedly saying, well, we could, take over Cargill and militarily. Well, why didn't we do that last time? If we had that capacity, that would have been tremendous leverage for the American side in the implementation of whatever kind of ceasefire negotiation. So what is different this time around? Do you think that this is just going to be tit for tat for a little bit? Where do you foresee this going?
Yeah. Hasan, let me first take a step back and address what you said, that, it turned out that the Iranians were right. I'm not so sure. There was a flare-up after they shot at some ships, and the Iranians were shooting at these ships because they're very suspicious. And this, I think they may be right on, which is that the U.S. side was trying to build a southern corridor that would be outside of the control of the Iranians, that would be kept open even if a war broke out again, and by that really reduce Iran's leverage significantly. And when ships started to go through that corridor without any coordination with Iran, the Iranians saw that as a major provocation. They shot at them. The U.S. bombed Iran. The Iranians bombed back. And then they went back to the table. After that, they were actually negotiating, and I wrote about it on the Substack, a compromise that could have worked, but they never managed to get to the end of it before the Iranian funeral of the supreme leader, in which diplomacy was paused. During that pause, several more ships tried to go through, turning off their transponders. The Iranians then again shot at those ships. And this caused like a freak out by Trump, in which he really lost his temper. We saw that his reactions publicly were very harsh. He said, you can't deal with these people, they're scum, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure that all of that actually was inevitable. I think the Iranians also overreacted to some of those ships. I think there's other ways that it could have been dealt with. And I can see a different scenario that could have been reached if they had done it that way instead of what we ended up with. But to your latter question, and I think this is also very important, because you mentioned that Vance had mentioned that, the strategic reserve. And that may very well have been the plan. But if you take a look at the numbers, at the time of the beginning of the war, the strategic reserves had about 415 million barrels. It is now down to 337. And it's not recuperated just because of the MOU has been in place for 1 month. So if the plan was, hey, let's recuperate that and then go back to war, that's not what we're seeing here at all. It's not gone back to that. In fact, it means that not only that, but also the rest of the global inventory that is still very much down, leads to a scenario in which if war happens, you really need to have a plan on how to get it done very quickly, because you simply cannot afford what happened last time. The runway for the US is much shorter than what it was last time. This will lead to an economic crisis much faster than the previous war did. And the previous war kept it off because the president used the strategic reserves to kind of calm the global oil markets. So to me, when I look at it, I don't see anything that suggests to me that this time around, war will work out better. That this time around, taking the Kharg Island, for instance, actually will be functioning. It's a smart military strategy. On the contrary, the oil reserves are at a lower inventory state than they were before. You're only 16 weeks away from the midterm elections. There's no way the US has managed to stock up on interceptors. The Iranians build missiles faster than the US build interceptors, and you oftentimes need to use several more interceptors to shoot down missiles. So none of this data in any way, shape, or form suggests that the US is in a better position to strike this, to go to war at this point.
Yeah. What do you say to the analysis that the American side, the American naval assets are? I mean, we have basically functionally half of our overall naval assets in this region right now. There's air defense systems. It's very clear that America at least tried to implement some sort of scheme even after Iran started striking at ships, because this is not the first time Iran struck ships. Iran had done so when they noticed that the Americans were trying to utilize the Omani corridor. And clearly there was an effort by the American side to try to see if they could even protect these ships at all. And that failed, right? Because the Iranian drones are virtually impossible to stop with the conventional and the anti-air defense systems that we currently have. I think that was an effort from the Iranian side to maintain their leverage, the ultimate leverage that they have, which is control over the Strait of Hormuz. And that was their interpretation of the Memorandum of Understanding as well. So do you feel like this was an attempt by the American side to try to see if they could even force the transiting of certain non-approved ships at odds with the Iranian control, to see if they could even defend these ships at all? And it was maybe a failure on that front as well?
I do think it's very fair to say that this was certainly an American attempt. I think the US side would say, look, we never accepted that Iran would have control over the Omani side. So yes, it was an American attempt, but it's not a provocation. The Iranians view it as a provocation. They view it as an effort to deliberately challenge the Iranians at a time when the Iranians were in the middle of their funeral and had their attention elsewhere. And I think, frankly, that may have also led to the Iranians overreacting a little bit. But I don't think there's any doubt that the US, even before the MOU, were trying to set up this southern corridor. This is part of the reason I think Trump actually at one point threatened to bomb Oman, because it is Oman's waters, but the Omanis were not in on this. The Omanis actually were the ones who were talking about a joint management system. And this really ticked off the U.S. side, particularly the more hawkish elements in it. And I remember when Trump made that threat, it sounded as if perhaps he misspoke, that he was going to say Iran instead he said Oman. I mean, at one point he did call it the Islamic Republic of Japan, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that he misspoke.
Yeah.
But it appears actually that he didn't misspeak, that it actually was a direct threat at the Omanis, and it was because the Omanis were trying to find a compromise, and the U.S. side was like, no, we don't want to do anything that allows for a compromise before at least we have exhausted the opportunity to see, can we create an alternative corridor that the Iranians cannot control, short of going to war with Oman itself.
So now the Trump administration has unveiled their second blockade once again. Earlier this morning, Donald Trump truthed on Truth Social that there would be a secondary blockade on the Gulf of Oman beyond the Iranian one, just as they had implemented one prior, and that there would be a 20% toll. Do you feel like this legitimizes the Iranian toll, ironically enough, because now all of a sudden people are going to be more comfortable with the idea of a toll for all ships that transit through the Strait of Hormuz, and the Iranian one, as the foreign minister Arakshi correctly pointed to, is only 2%, which is far more manageable, far more reasonable than the 20% that Donald Trump wants?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if he mentioned 2% in his tweet. I did a calculation. It would land at 1 to 2% because they were going to charge roughly $1 million per ship, which would amount to roughly 1 to 2% added cost to any tanker going through the straits, which still, compared to what the Turks are charging in Bosphorus, for instance, is a little bit higher, but nevertheless, 20%. I mean, frankly, Trump is not only validating the Iranian position inadvertently, he is also making the Iranian position or the Iranian plan rather attractive because it is much, much cheaper. And this is combined with other messages that he sent that everything in Iran is going to be owned by the US. I think he's going back to these fantasies that he had early on in February, in which he thought that what he did in Venezuela can be replicated in Iran. And I think it's coming from that position of deep, deep frustration that things are frankly not going in his way. And I think one of the things the Iranians have tried to figure out Trump's psychology and use psychologists when it comes to writing messages to him to make sure that they kind of got a better response from him. One thing I think they missed is that he has this need for constant positive reinforcement. He needs the diplomacy to constantly produce an assembly line of good news. And if it doesn't, he just kind of gets frustrated and then can do a 180 and go back towards war. And I'm sure after a while, he's going to get frustrated with the war and try to go back to diplomacy. But it's just not the way that you can do diplomacy between two countries that have defined each other as enemies for 47 years.
Also, on top of that, the conflict is yielding tremendous volatility in the global energy markets, and is slated to hit a hard limit where this global commodity that is necessary for survival, necessary for the grids to continue, for commodities to continue to be produced in the Asian markets, that'll then create an inflationary crisis in the United States. That's what's at stake here. The stakes are unbelievably high. So one of the other questions I had for you also is Saudi Arabia, which seemingly has decided to become more active in this conflict for some weird reason, out of nowhere, out of left field. There was a bombing of the airport, an airport runway in Sanaa that the Houthis have now responded to. There's talks about potentially closing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait as well. What do you think about that? Why is Saudi Arabia getting more active in this conflict? And where do you see that going?
So I don't think it's clear yet that is exactly what the Saudis are trying to do. I think it's important to keep in mind there is a UN Security Council resolution, which I don't know if it was the right resolution, but nevertheless, to have a blockade of the Houthi-controlled territories. And once the Iranians and the Saudis normalized relations, and both of them kind of backed off, and the war against the Houthis more or less died down, nevertheless, that resolution remains in place, and the Saudis have been insistent on making sure that the Houthis cannot reconstitute an open logistical transit route to the Iranians by air. The Iranians appear to have tried to challenge that during the funeral because they sent a plane to Sana'a to pick up Houthi officials to go to the funeral. The Saudis tried to stop that, but they failed. But now when that plane is coming back, they're trying to they're trying to make something to make sure that this is not a new normalized relation. So I think that is the root of this, but it is taking place in the context of this larger conflict. And as a result, has a significant risk, even if that is not the intent of it, to spill over into that. And that could, as you mentioned, lead to the closing of the strait in the Red Sea as well. And if that were to happen, that is a major, major escalation. My own suspicion is the Iranians do not want to see that happen until there is a major escalation by the US, and then this would be the response to it, rather than them doing it preemptively and by that justifying further escalation by the United States. So far we've seen talk about it. We've not seen any real measures that they're doing it.
I guess the $1 million question or the $1 trillion question is, where do we go from here? If America is going back to striking Iran and trying to somehow gain some kind of leverage that they failed to do so in the last 130-day operation, what do they think they can get out of it when on the strategic oil reserve side they have even less runway? What the hell is going on? I mean, it's clear that the war of attrition is more beneficial for Iran than it is for the United States of America. Obviously, they're suffering as well if there's a blockade. Their economy is in tatters, certainly. But at the end of the day, they're used to a level of sanctions regardless. They've built some semblance of resilience regardless. And therefore, they're better positioned overall as they were during Operation Epic Fury. Where do we go from here? Why is America doing this again? Also, how much involvement does Israel have in this second destabilization operation that destroyed the Memorandum of Understanding?
So on your first question, I have a piece in Responsible Statecraft about this, and I was going to add a paragraph mentioning that sheer stupidity is not included in any major IR theory, but it actually deserves a significant role because so much of what is done is decisions that are really not based on any clear wisdom and is more in the imbecile category. To me, this is just plain out stupid for the very same reasons that you said. I do not, unless, again, there is some sort of a conclusion that there is another military option that can wrap this up in less than a week or two.
They haven't deployed. That they've just weirdly enough, out of the kindness of their hearts, did not deploy against their foreign adversary 47 years.
Exactly. And certainly not in the previous just couple of months. So I'm extremely skeptical. And as a result, I do think that this is, at best, it's going to lead, and this is really at best, if we're lucky, there will be a return to the table. Facts on the ground will not have changed dramatically in either direction. The only thing that will have changed is that the lure of thinking that through military action, you can reorganize the situation in a manner that gives you the benefit at the negotiating table, that lure essentially has been eliminated more or less. That's the only thing I can see. That would be the best case scenario because I don't believe that this is going to give any major change. In fact, I think it's going to be very difficult to get back to the table after this. The Iranians are increasingly convinced that even if Trump has an intent for a deal, he does not have the capacity to actually strike a deal, and the American political system does not have the quality left in it to sustain a deal once there is a different administration in place. This is a concern they already had during Biden. They were worried that they would be giving up their leverage, and then Trump would come back in and would uproot that agreement. And now I think it's become even further. Let me give you an example. As one of the first measures they did in this round of escalation is that general license that had been granted to the Iranians to sell their oil because the US itself needed more oil on the market and needed to push down oil prices. They rescinded it. Now, I can understand that as part of the escalation, this is probably one of the less violent measures that could be done. But what it does is that it tells you that the longevity and the stability of such a waiver is so fragile that it loses its potency at the negotiating table as a bargaining chip. Because for it to be valuable to the Iranians, it needs to be stable because they already have hard time, difficulties getting new purchasers of their oil because most countries like, well, we don't know if the US is going to stick to this deal. So we don't want to start, binding ourselves to some long-term contract with you for oil delivery if the US is just going to flip in a week. And then it did. It flipped within a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So now next time when the US goes to the table and say, hey, we'll grant you an oil waiver, the value of that bargaining chip is going to be far less than it was last time because it's been proven again to be so flimsy, so easily revoked.
Yeah. There's also obviously the confidence that they have in Americans following on their commitments, which clearly, time and time again, perfidy is deployed with regular frequency. So there's no confidence whatsoever. This obviously probably gives a lot more legitimacy to the hardliners. On the Iranian side, they have been, fairly cohesive throughout this process, and yet, if I'm a hardliner, I'm looking at the situation and going, I mean, what do you want? We achieved negotiations through battle. We fought and we bled for this additional leverage that we gained, and now America's proven once again that the only way out of this is to fight. So I don't know what internal leverage the reformers of the more moderate factions have at this point, given that America's shown time and time again that they're not remotely interested in a serious negotiations process. How do you foresee that going? That power grab internally in Iran?
So, I think we're already seeing that. They're increasingly concluding that the US was intending to go to war from the outset. I personally don't think that is necessarily correct, but that is what they're seeing. And I think the Iranians going forward are going to be even more difficult to deal with because, again, for them now to be able to muster the type of consensus that is needed in their system to be able to sign an agreement, to come to a yes, is going to become even more difficult than it was before. This is one of those things also, and I've mentioned this publicly before, that I had told the administration prior to the war that they're really kind of miscalculating the Iranians. It's not about them being ideological or courageous, but I just don't see the system being capable of surrendering. And the reason for that is that they need to get to a consensus to surrender. And that consensus is just impossible for them to achieve. There will always be some faction, probably not a weak faction, that would refuse to do so. And as a result, as Trump was constantly looking for the Iranians to surrender, he just completely miscalculated. He didn't understand their thinking, but also didn't understand their system. And that, but to a less intense extent, is also going to be the case when it comes to an agreement going forward. We saw that back in the JCPOA. It was a hell of a fight to get that system to come to an agreement for the JCPOA. It was difficult as well to get to the MOU. And I don't know if you saw some of the images of how hardliners were harassing the foreign minister and others during the funeral, accusing them of being compromisers and appeasers. The very same language and narratives and discourse that we see in Washington, in which diplomacy is weakness, compromise is a negative word, you have it on the Iranian side as well.
I will admit,
as you mentioned, those voices are the ones that are strengthened by these episodes.
Yeah, they have more. Iran currently has more real popular mobilization and support for continuing the war on military terms than the United States does. Like there's no American rallies taking place in the United States of America. The only people that are hardliners in the same way that like the Iranian hardliners are Israelis for the most part. That's it.
Or they're in the Beltway.
Yeah.
People in the Beltway who live off of this stuff.
But there is no like mass mobilization demanding that Donald Trump continue waging this war, especially because Americans, well, we're very selfish people, and the only impact that we have, that we care about, is gas prices, and everyone is noticing that the gas prices are going up.
Yeah. But the flip side of that, Hasan, is also very important. And frankly, something that I'm disappointed in. But I think it goes back to exactly what you said, which is the gas prices, which is yes, but also there's not been the type of mass mobilization that I think was needed to push back against this war. So you don't have people protesting in mass numbers in American streets against the war either. And I think part of the reason why that is not happening is because the administration has used the strategic reserves to keep oil gas prices artificially low in order to avoid that scenario.
And there's no ground troops. There's no ground troops mobilization.
Once you get to a ground troop scenario and you have a larger number of Americans coming home in coffins, then it's just a ticking time bomb before those type of protests will happen. But this is the problem with America's wars in general. The American public in general tends to be against these wars. But by keeping the wars as distant as possible from the public and making sure that the consequences are as minimal or as spread out as possible. And you saw that during the Obama administration. They didn't want to have body bags, so they went over to this kind of drone warfare, which caused massive amount of civilian casualties, but it made sure that the risk of American soldiers getting killed were really minimized. And they got away with doing the war, continuing all these wars, but doing it that way because it shielded the public from the costs. And the administration has taken similar measures with this war as well to keep the costs low.
Yeah. I know we have a limited amount of time. I just wanted to ask you one final question before we let you go. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Section 219, formerly Section 224 of the House Fiscal Year 2027 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, is establishing that the United States and Israel Defense Technology Cooperation Initiative. Now, of course, you're very familiar with this. Responsible Statecraft has written extensively on it. For those in my audience that might not know, it directs the Department of Defense to appoint an executive agent to accelerate joint research, development, and integration of Israeli and U.S. defense technologies. In layman's terms, this is a merger between the Israeli military and the United States military. The provision focuses on sensitive modern military domains, including artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, quantum computing, yada, yada, yada. It would make it virtually impossible to even utilize the existing mechanisms, the existing legal framework to hold Israel to account for its genocide, to restrain Israel in any meaningful capacity, or to deny Israel any military aid and arms embargo and the like. Where do you think this is going? There's a lot of debate around it, and what do you foresee happening here with this cooperative agreement?
Yeah. So look, this is a crucial issue, and I think this is the reaction of the pro-Israel, the pro-Likud groups in Washington, as well as the Israeli government, to the fact, and you're one of the leading voices of that, the American public, particularly younger Americans, are waking up to the very negative aspects of the U.S.-Israeli relations. They're turning against it, and it has translated into serious bills in the Senate to end funding, not just defensive, but all funding of the Israeli military. And this is frankly a very clever maneuver by them to actually take that and then embed Israel inside of the American military and the Pentagon budget and make it a bureaucratic exercise, not something that has oversight by Congress, not something that Congress has to vote on every X amount of years, etc. This allows the money not only to go up, but it allows the money to be hidden from the American public.
Yeah.
And this is their reaction to recognizing they are losing the American public. Now, whether it will succeed or not, I haven't followed the latest things. There are other people at Quincy. In fact, Steve Simon is the one who wrote the first piece on this and really in detail explained what the Israelis were doing on this, who would be in a much better position to say where the status is. But I can tell you, if it passes, it means that essentially this very in my view, negative relationship between the United States and Israel, the one that is based on this carte blanche, the one that is based on essentially just allowing the Israelis to do whatever they want, will be given another and a very major new lease on life.
Yeah, this I think is a direct response to the growing demands to decouple America from Israel. It would make it much easier for Israel to simply turn around and say, okay, we're not getting any more military aid from the United States of America, and turn the relationship de facto into the similar structure that already exists for jet fuel, for example. Many people would not know this, but like the American government sends Israel jet fuel as a part of its Pentagon budget, and it's not above the it's not an above board expenditure that would be written about as military aid to Israel. So this would turn every part of our security cooperative relationship into this opaque structure that is not is much more difficult to identify and much more difficult to restrain. A terrifying bill. And you know, a new version of the depravity that I have grown to expect from the American government, and certainly the Israeli one. Trita, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it, Hasan.
What do you want to promote before we let you go? You got your Substack?
Yeah, so my Substack is just tritaparsi.substack.com. You can follow me on Twitter at tparsi, and also, of course, the Quincy Institute's website, quincyinst.org, or Responsible Statecrafts magazine, which is responsiblestatecraft.org.
All right. Thank you so much, Trita,
Thanks
for
so much.
coming on,
Appreciate
as
it.
always. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. That was Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute. I did not ask him about Ahmadinejad. I forgot to ask him about Ahmadinejad, but I feel like that's, you know,